Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Mom Chilo. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. Today, we're going to turn to an early medieval patristic text by St. Gregory the Great, the Pope of Rome, or as he's also known as St. Gregory the Dialogist. And the work that we're covering is the Dialogues, the work that he gets, one of his names from. So he's kind of like St. John Climacus, who wrote the Ladder of Divine Ascent, who, that work became so famous that it ended up being, one of his names that people called him by. So we're going over St. Gregory the Dialogist, Pope of Rome. So he was Pope from about 590 AD to about 604 AD when he died. And obviously he was in Italy as Pope of Rome. And during this time, and this is kind of important for some of the context, during this time in Italy, there was a lot of turmoil going on. You had all these Lombards, you had various, Gothic invasions that occurred, as well as, plagues, famines. A lot of it was a very tumultuous time. So Italy, which had been the capital of the Roman Empire, Rome was the capital, but Italy by extension was kind of like the main province of the Roman Empire, where all the wealth was at, or at least where a lot of the wealth was at. At this time, because of all the invasions, Italy is a lot poorer than it was when it was under the Roman Empire. For instance, the city of Rome, which, once had over 1 million people, is now totally decimated and has just like maybe 10,000 people, depending on the time. The city is really hollowed out, and there's a lot of destruction that went on. And in some sense, there was a quote-unquote Dark Ages, you could say, in this early medieval time in the Western Empire. However, we're going to see how Gregory deals with this idea, or with the fact that Italy and Rome has declined so much. We're going to see his sort of philosophy of history or theology of history later in this episode. So just a little bit of more background. So this text specifically was written in about 593 AD, give or take. And Gregory's sort of what he wants to do here. So he has these 4 dialogues within the dialogues, or 4 books, I guess you could say, or 4 chapters. And in each of them, he talks a lot about various lives of the saints, specifically or almost exclusively lives of the saints of Italy. And the most famous part of this dialogue would probably be Book 2, where he goes quite in depth into the life of Saint Benedict. And it's really the main source that we have for Saint Benedict's life. So the main purpose of this book is to document all these saints of Italy, and a lot of them are quite recent saints, like maybe they've only been dead for maybe 50 years or so. And what he wants to show is that even though there's all this turmoil, the Western Roman Empire is completely gone at this point. It's been gone for over 100 years. So Rome, or at least Rome in the West, falls in 476 AD, and that's generally considered, or at least that's what I consider, the start of the medieval period. And then after that, you had all these barbarian invasions that just, wreaked havoc on the land. You also had invasions or liberations, as some people might call them, from the Eastern Roman Empire, where they would go back to Italy and reclaim various lands. Like they held Rome for a little bit, and they held the, southern Italy for a little bit as well. But nothing, stuck for too long. But regardless, Gregory is looking at all the damage by the Lombards, the Ostrogoths, and all these other groups. And he wants to show that despite all of that there are still saints in Italy, and that there is still God's providence is still at play in Italy. God hasn't abandoned Italy, even though from a political or economic perspective, it might seem that way. And it's made even worse by the fact that these invaders aren't even Orthodox or Catholic Christians. Rather, they're largely Arian, and they set up their own kind of like parallel ecclesiastical structure where they have their own Arian bishops and their own Arian churches. And then, Gregory is like the Pope of Rome, and, Italy has no uniting. It's not united politically anymore. There's all these various territories and factions and empires there. So Gregory, in some sense, is kind of like the binding force of Italy at the time, or the most unifying figure. And he wants to say, look, even though all this stuff has happened, God's providence is still at work, as I said earlier. And one of the points of the book is to say that, even though there's all this destruction going on, there's the Christian answer, the Christian response to this is pretty much the same it's always been, since the time of Jesus or even beforehand, which is that, there's certain Christian duties that we must fulfill no matter what the circumstances are. There's certain virtues we must uphold. And the other one is an emphasis on monasticism. So you see this a lot in Italy at the time, where you have Saint Benedict, who's reforming monasticism in a large way. He's making sure that the monks are living by strict rules and aren't just doing whatever they want. And Gregory also condemns his efforts and says that's a good thing, and he wants to sort of continue that legacy. And Saint Gregory himself used to be a monastic before he was made the Pope of Rome. And he actually founded several monasteries as well, because he got quite a large inheritance, because he came from quite a wealthy and powerful family. Like at one point he was the papal emissary to the court of Constantinople. And once he had this large inheritance, he established several monasteries, and he lived in a monastery himself. And he himself actually comes from a quite holy family. He has several family members who are canonized saints, as well as his great-great-grandfather was Pope Felix III. Now, in terms of genre, this book is written as a dialogue between Gregory himself and one of his deacons, so that would be Deacon Peter. And Peter sort of serves as a foil, kind of like in the Platonic dialogues, where he asks follow-up questions in which Gregory responds, or he gives like potential objections to some things, which Gregory then responds to. But for the most part, maybe like 80% or so of the actual text is Gregory speaking. And throughout the text, Gregory is very concerned with having reliable sources. I'm not going to talk too much or mention too much of like the exact sources, because he has a bunch of them and he kind of mentions them offhand, and it'll kind of interrupt the flow if I went through every single one of them. But he often says things like, "Oh, I heard this from this bishop," or "I heard this from this person," or he's very concerned about citing his sources. And some of these miracles and lives of the saints that he talks about, he even witnessed himself, and we'll get into that later. And this isn't just like a rhetorical device. We actually have, like, for instance, some letters that he wrote to various people asking for information about the life of so-and-so, or information regarding miracles that so-and-so did or that happened to them. So, he's not just saying, "Oh, trust me, bro." Rather, he actually has his sources. Now, there's a lot going on in the dialogues, and I'm not going to be able to cover every single facet of the dialogues. So in the edition that I have that's published by the Catholic University Press of America, the translation done by Odo John Zimmerman, the book runs about 275 pages. You can also find a much older translation that's in the public domain as well. It's kind of written in like a little bit of Victorian English, so maybe the English isn't so readable, and I'm not too sure how well the translation is, but that's easily available online, and I'll put some links in the description if you want to read it online. Or you can just buy the Zimmerman translation. However, I will say it is a little bit pricey, especially for a paperback, and there are some like formatting errors, like sometimes like the edges of the words aren't always there. It's a little weird, so a little disappointed in that. However, that's there if you want as well. But so because the book is so big, I can only focus on a couple things. So there's a couple of themes I want to emphasize while we go throughout the text. So one is that Italy indeed has saints. Despite all the chaos, God is still working in Italy, and Italy has saints just like the East has all their saints as well. The other theme is that in the same way that we can view the Bible typologically, we can also, and Gregory kind of says that we should view history in the same way. And I'll give a couple examples of how he does that later. And then the other theme is various theological lessons that he derives from the experience of the church, and not so much from like a purely intellectual exercise where you write like a treatise. So Gregory, as I said, is constantly citing these stories of saints, various miracles. So it's a very, I guess you could say, embodied way of doing theology. And we'll get into that. So the outline that we're going to do, so we're going to go through books 1 and 3 at first, and then we'll go to book 2, which covers the life of Saint Benedict in depth, and then we'll go to the last book, which talks about the soul after death. So at the start of the dialogues, Gregory is lamenting to Deacon Peter about his formal monastic life compared with all the cares, worldly cares that he has to, concern himself with now that he is the Bishop of Rome or the Pope of Rome. He says, "But now all the beauty of that spiritual repose, so monasticism, is gone, and the contact with worldly men and their affairs, which is a necessary part of my duties as bishop, has left my soul defiled with earthly activities. I am so distracted with external occupations and my concern for the people that even when my spirit resumes its striving after the interior life, it always does so with less vigor. Then, as I compare what I have lost with what I must now endure, the contrast only makes my present lot more burdensome. I am tossed about on the waves of a heavy sea, and my soul is like a helpless ship buffeted by raging winds. When I recall my former way of life, it is as though I were once looking back towards land and sighing as I beheld the shore. It only saddens me the more to find that, while flung about by the mighty waves that carry me along, I can hardly catch sight any longer of the harbor I have left. At times, I find myself reflecting with even greater regret on the life that others lead who have totally abandoned the present world. Seeing the heights these men have achieved only makes me realize the lowly state of my own soul. It was by spending their days in seclusion that most of them pleased their Creator, and to keep them from dulling their spiritual fervor with human activities, God chose to leave them free from worldly occupations." Peter then asks him to tell him about some of these lives of the saints that he knows of, or that he has just mentioned. And then Peter then says, "The lives of the saints are often more effective than mere instruction for inspiring us to love heaven as our own home." So here we see a little bit about the purpose of hagiography. It's to, inspire us to, behave better and to, love heaven and love God. And Gregory responds, "I shall not hesitate to narrate what I have learned from worthy men. In this, I'm only following the consecrated practice of the Scriptures, where it is perfectly clear that Mark and Luke composed their Gospels not as eyewitnesses, but on the word of others. Nevertheless, to remove any grounds for doubt on the part of my readers, I'm going to indicate on whose authority each account is based." So, in Gregory's perspective, hagiography, or describing the lives of the saints, is already in Scripture. It's already like a genre in Scripture, and he cites Luke and Mark, who were not apostles, unlike Saint John and Saint Matthew, who wrote Gospels, but were one of Jesus's apostles and very often eyewitnesses to what they described. So for Gregory, he's just continuing the genre or the legacy of Saint Mark and Saint Luke and the way that they composed their Gospels. The first story that Gregory tells us is about a young boy, Honoratus, who, he says, cultivated a deep love for his heavenly home. So while the boy was still living with his parents, they one day served him meat at dinner, and then he refused because, monastics don't eat meat. They'll eat fish, but they don't eat meat even on non-fasting days. But then his parents told him that there is no fish because they live in the mountains. But as they were serving water and, dishing out the water, a fish fell out, and he was able to eat that for his dinner. And we're later told that he would go on to build a monastery and lead 200 monks. As you can imagine, in the medieval world, especially in the sort of post-apocalyptic landscape of Italy, ravaged by the Ostrogoths and the Lombards, we're going to see a lot of miracles involving food, because food was often scarce, people often ran out of food, famine, plagues, etc. So food, and God providing food especially, is one of the connecting themes to a lot of the stories that Gregory tells. So after Gregory tells the story, Peter says that such a boy would have needed a spiritual guide. And Gregory says that generally speaking, this is the case, but there is no law on the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit works however it wills. And Honoratus was like St. John the Baptist, who also didn't have any sort of spiritual father, but was instead just guided directly by the Holy Spirit. And so when Honoratus died, he had several disciples, and one of his disciples was Libertinus, who always carried with him the sandal of Honoratus as a sort of relic from his spiritual father. And so while Libertinus is out walking about, he finds an ailing mother with a dead child, and the mother implores him to bring him back to life. And the way it's told, it's as if he couldn't move until he at least attempted the mother's request. So he placed the sandal of Saint Honoratus on the child, and he came back to life. And then we're told that it's because he had humility, that Libertinus had humility and trusted in his master's power more than his own. Gregory then relates a story about Constantius, a holy man, who he was charged with filling the church's lamps with oil. But as they had run out of oil, he just simply filled the lamps up with water, and then they burned as if they were filled with oil. Try to imagine, says Gregory, how great must have been the merits of the man who could change the nature of a physical element. And then the point that Gregory makes with that statement is that it's because the man was holy and had done these great deeds and had these great merits that he was able to perform the miracle. His point is that great deeds precede miracles. Miracles in themselves aren't necessarily great deeds. So those who are miracle workers because of their holiness. They're not holy because they are miracle workers. The miracles they work, in a sense, just express outwardly their holiness or how holy they are. But there is an issue with miracles, or those who can perform miracles, and namely that is that it can be a source of temptation. However, for Constantius, this wasn't an issue. So, people had heard about his miracles, and his fame grew far and wide. And then one day a farmer comes to meet him. He traveled a great distance to see him, and he was very underwhelmed by his appearance when he was pointed out. And he says, "This fellow," pointing to Constantius, "has nothing manly about him." And then Constantius begins to hug and kiss the man. And he tells him, "You are the only one who has looked at me with open eyes." The degree of humility Constantius had acquired must be, Gregory says, judged from this act, since it shows the great love he had for one who despised him. It takes an insult to prove our hidden qualities. And this is how we know that he was a saint, because he worked the miracles, but he didn't let the miracles become a sense of pride for him. Okay, so for this next story, we learn about Saint Nonusus and his monastery, and how one day they had run out of oil in the monastery. So running out of oil is quite a common theme, as you would imagine, in a land filled with plague and famine, where your crops don't grow and you don't have necessarily the money always to buy oil. So since they had run out of oil, the abbot of the monastery told his monks that in the next day they should go out in the town and basically work for some of the townspeople in exchange for oil. But Nonusus says, or rather he saw that great spiritual harm would come about from this, because if the monks intermingled too much with people from the outside world, they might kind of revert back to a more worldly way of living. So, because he saw the harm that could come by this, he prayed, and then the next day, the oil jars were all filled with oil, and the monks didn't need to go out into the world to work for oil. And then God compares this to the story of Elisha in the Old Testament, and he says that the new miracles imitate the old miracles, and that God is still at work. So, in the same God that worked in the Old Testament, he's still working in the same way, not even in the New Testament, but even today in our current times. One day in a monastery, God called out, "Anastasius, come." And so Anastasius was one of the monks at the monastery. And he also named 7 other people that were also supposed to come. So God calls these 8 people, and the idea is that they're all going to die relatively soon. And then shortly after, they all get sick, and then they pass away. But before Anastasius passes away, one of the monks, who was not called out by God, asked Anastasius on his deathbed that he could also be allowed to depart. And then he died 1 week later after they all did, even though his name wasn't called. So then Peter asked the question. He says, "Since this monk was not summoned with the others, yet was taken out of the world through the prayers of the holy Anastasius, what am I to conclude but that the great saints are sometimes able to obtain what God has not predestined?" Now, Gregory's response is interesting. He says, by no means. He says, holy men cannot obtain what has not been predestined. So there's still predestination in a sense. However, it's not so cut and dry of what exactly predestination entails, at least like temporally. So he gives the example of Abraham. So God tells Abraham about how he's going to have all these descendants and have this, great and mighty nation, as numerous as the sands on the sea, etc. However, Abraham's wife was infertile. She was sterile and old, by the time that Abraham learned of this promise. So, does that mean that God didn't predestine Abraham? But no, rather what Gregory is trying to conclude here is that God takes into account our, free will and our prayers. So because this monk, asked Anastasius to pray for him that he can also be called and taken up out of the world into heaven, along with the 8 others, God had, in a sense, predestined him to be called up, even though his name wasn't called up, if that makes sense. So essentially, it's not saying that we change God's mind when we pray, but rather our prayers have a real effect and that God does listen to us, and that, in a sense, because God isn't bound temporally in time, that our prayers in one instance can affect how things happen in the past or in the future. That seems to be what Gregory is getting at here. But this is no means like some type of like Calvinistic double predestination. We then learn of Boniface, the Bishop of Ferentino, who miraculously churns just a few clusters of grapes into wine, like wine that's overflowing that he's able to distribute to the poor of his diocese. His nephew sees this, though, and when he realizes his nephew sees him, Boniface tells his nephew that he's not to tell anyone about this until he has died. So remember, as I said, miracles for Gregory are often the source of temptation for these saints. So they have to make sure that the miracles don't turn around and bite them. They don't become a source of pride for them. And this is actually something you see quite a lot, is that even with like modern saints, you learn about how they'll have like a spiritual child, but they'll tell them like, look, don't tell anybody about me really until I am dead. Right, and they'll even go to quite great lengths to sort of hide who they are, or kind of like, not let the word about various miracles or various things they've done kind of reach the broader public. And Gregory relates this to the Gospels. In fact, he says, every act our Redeemer performed through his human nature was meant to be a pattern for our actions, so that in following his footsteps, according to the measure of our ability, we might walk unfalteringly along the path of our present life work. And so our Lord, having performed the miracle, commended the 2 men to tell no one, and yet he could not stop them from spreading the fame of it. The purpose of this was to show his disciples that in following the example of his teaching, they should have the will to remain hidden in their great deeds, but that their holy deeds should be made public against their will for the benefit of others. Thus, the desire to keep their good works hidden would be an expression of great humility, while the inability to keep them so would bring great profit to others. So specifically, he referenced earlier the time when Jesus healed 2 blind men and told them not to tell anybody, but yet they go about and tell everybody. But there's several other examples of this happening in the Gospels, especially throughout Mark's Gospel. There seems to be a particular emphasis there. So there's a couple of things I want to touch on here. So one is that Gregory is affirming the 5th Ecumenical Council here when he says every act our Redeemer performed through his human nature. So he's implicitly implying that Christ has a human nature and then a divine nature, right? So that's against the Monophysite position and for the Orthodox Catholic position that was affirmed at the 5th Ecumenical Council. And this is somewhat relevant, historically speaking, because the 5th Ecumenical Council was held in 553, but there were still issues that lingered on, or not even lingered on, but there were still issues regarding Monophysitism all the way up until, today, arguably, but, for a long time, there was various Monophysite emperors in Constantinople and things like that. So pretty relevant here that he's taken a very firm position for the 5th Ecumenical Council. However, the other thing I want to point out is that even though you're not supposed to brag about your miracles, and you're even supposed to try to suppress them, or at least the fact that they happened, so you don't get this sense of pride, as a temptation. There's still a sense in which the point of the miracles is to bring people closer to God. So nonetheless, the miracles will still have a sort of life of their own and still reach out to the broader public, yet you're not supposed to flaunt them. So when Jesus in the Gospels tells people, not to tell anyone about the miracles, and then we learn that those people, do end up, talking about the miracles that happened. Gregory's point here is that those people, they're not doing anything bad when they go about and tell about the miracles, but rather Jesus is giving the example of humility, and that we are supposed to follow that. So on a Holy Saturday, Marcellus, who was an exemplary man, we are told, died, and his two sisters begged Bishop Fortunatus to bring their brother back, but the bishop said that it was God's will and that he can't undo it. But when the bishop finally comes to attend to the corpse, as he's supposed to do, and he says his name, then the man, Marcellus, comes back to life. And Marcellus, who has now been raised from the dead, he describes what he saw. He says, "Yesterday, so when he was dead, two people came to release me from the body and lead me to the abode of the blessed. Today a messenger is sent to them with the command, 'Take him back, because Bishop Fortunatus is visiting at his home.'" Marcellus quickly regained his strength and lived for a long time after this episode. And Gregory is also keen to point out here that just because he was brought back to the earth, from his sort of transitory state between heaven and earth, it doesn't mean that that he's losing his reward or anything. In fact, he's actually able to live a more holy life now that he has sort of seen a hint of what heaven is going to be like. So Gregory tells a lot of these stories, and eventually Peter says, "These are truly remarkable deeds. Up to the present, they were entirely unknown to me. How is it that we cannot find men of this type today?" But then Gregory responds. He says, "I believe there are still many such men in the world, Peter. One cannot conclude that there are no great saints just because no great miracles are worked. The true estimate of life, after all, lies in acts of virtue, not in the display of miracles. There are many, Peter, who without performing miracles are not at all inferior to those who perform them." So this harkens back to what Gregory argued earlier, that miracles don't make you saintly. Saintly people are able to produce miracles. But just because you don't produce miracles doesn't mean that your holiness is, in question or something like that. Rather, as Gregory says, it's virtues that make you a saint, not performing miracles. So he's telling Peter, he's like, look, you might not see people performing miracles every day. However, that doesn't mean that saints don't exist today. So this is everything that I'm going to cover from book 1. There's a lot of other great stories in, the first dialogue, but I just don't have time to go through them all. So we'll turn now to book 3. And as I said, we'll circle back to book 2 and talk about Saint Benedict later. So in book 3, or dialogue 3, Gregory gives an example of a certain Bishop Paulinus. So he says this Bishop Paulinus, he was a bishop during the time of Vandal occupation in Italy. And during this time, there's a lot of turmoil and suffering. And in order to help, the people around him, Bishop Paulinus basically sold everything in the episcopal residency to help those suffering, including he would buy prisoners, buy food for people, things like that. And then one day a widow comes to him asking for help, saying that her son was captured by the Vandal king's son-in-law. And then Bishop Paulinus, he looks around and then he realizes that there's basically nothing left for him to sell. So since he has nothing left to sell, he goes and trades himself basically as ransom for her son. So the son is freed, but Bishop Paulinus becomes like a slave or a servant of the Vandal king's son-in-law. And he becomes his gardener, actually. And he says that he was actually a very good gardener, and that his master, really enjoyed, the fruits of his labor. And he actually ends up having a little bit of a relationship with his gardener, or Bishop Paulinus, because he realizes that he is a wise man. He often has these long talks with him. And then one day, Bishop Paulinus tells his master that his father-in-law, the king, the Vandal king, is about to die. So he goes and tells his king what his gardener said, and the king says, "What you have heard is true," he confessed, "for last night in a dream I saw judges sitting opposite me in a courtroom, and this man," so Bishop Paulinus, "was one of them. By their verdict, the scourge I had once been given was taken from my hand. Go therefore and find out who he really is, for I suspect that a man of such merit is not the ordinary person he appears to be." So he presses Bishop Paulinus to tell him who he really is, and then eventually Paulinus tells him that he is a bishop. And then upon hearing this, we're told the barbarian was overawed. "Ask what you will," he said, "only do not return to your homeland without rich presents from me. To this Paulinus answered, "The best gift you can offer me is to free all my fellow citizens from captivity." Without delay, these captives were brought together from different parts of Africa and, as a special act of courtesy to Paulinus, were set aboard ships loaded with grain to sail back to Italy together with their saintly bishop. So now we can turn to another story. So this is about the bishop Datius. So one day this bishop Datius was walking into town and he was looking for a lodging for the night. And he finds like an empty house, but the townspeople told him that he would not be able to stay in that house because the devil had inhabited it for many years. In fact, that was the reason why it had been standing idle all this time. But Datius answered, "All the more reason for us to take up our residence there, since the evil spirit haunts it and drives all human occupants away." And so, after converting the house into his living quarters, he entered it fearlessly to await the onslaught of Satan. And then, so that night, while he's trying to sleep, he hears all these noises, and he hears, we're told that the enemy of mankind began to create a terrible din, imitating the roaring of lions, the bleating of sheep, and the screaming of mules. But then, when Datius gets up, he rebukes the spirits, and he says, "It serves you right, you wretch," he said. "You are the one who said, 'I will ascend above the height of the clouds. I will become like the Most High.' Because of your pride, you have become like a pig and a mouse. Because you baselessly wish to imitate God, you find yourself now imitating animals as you deserve." So with this, the evil spirits then go away from the house. So essentially, Bishop Datius is able to perform like an exorcism of sorts on the house and remove the evil spirits who occupied it. And here we see this theme that we've seen, elsewhere, of the spiritual conquest, of retaking the land from demons. Like right when we did our episode on St. Guthlic over in England, we saw that he inhabits this island. Or like kind of like this island and this marshland, and then he's able to remove the demons who occupied it. And this is a common theme you see in monasticism, where people go out into the wilderness or the desert, whether that be like the tundra or like an actual sandy desert or whatever it might be. And through their holiness and their prayer and their warfare against the demons, they're able to expel the demons from the land and retake it for God. And now another story about a bishop. So this is about Bishop Sabinus. So one day he was informed by one of his deacons that the Po River was flooding. So he tells his deacon to tell the river, "The bishop commands you to control yourself and return to your channel." But the deacon just kind of laughs at this and doesn't take it that seriously, and he doesn't do it. So then the bishop tells his secretary to write a note, basically saying the same thing, and throw it into the river. And when his secretary goes into the river and throws the note into the river, it works, and the river, recedes back and it stops flooding. So this is kind of another theme. It's similar to the idea of like spiritual conquest, but this is more so the fact that, or more so taps into the idea that these holy people are able to have a certain relationship with nature, and they're able to restore nature back to its original purpose and prevent it from being destructive. And this relates to another similar story regarding Bishop Serbonius, who got into trouble with some of the Goths and King Totila, who was like the king of the Goths. And he was condemned to death, and he was to be eaten by wild bears in this public spectacle. But when the bears were released on him, they were very ferocious at first. But once they got near the bishop, the saintly man, they all of a sudden became very passive, and they began just to lick the bishop, very meekly. So again, we see how these holy people are able to have a special relationship with nature. So there's another bear story I want to tell about. So this one is regarding Saint Florentius. So he was a hermit. He had one companion for a while, but then that companion left him, and he went to go become an abbot. So he's now just a hermit living by himself. And because he is now living by himself, he prayed to God that God would give him some sort of companion to, help him in his loneliness and his struggle. And then he finds a bear, and this bear is very passive, very meek. And Florentius realizes that his prayer had been answered by God giving him this bear. So he entrusts the bear to shepherd sheep. And the bear always came back at the time he was asked to come back. And, he listens to Florentius. However, some other monks elsewhere, they became jealous that he was able to do this, able to perform these miracles. So they actually kill the bear. And then once he realizes what has happened and how his bear died and how the monks killed it, we're told that he was distracted with grief and pronounced a curse on the monks. And he said, "I hope to God that before they die, they will be punished in the sight of all for killing my bear who never did them any harm." And then we're told divine retribution followed quickly. The 4 monks who had killed the bear were struck with leprosy and died a horrible death. However, we're not told that this was a good thing. In fact, quite the opposite. Gregory's commentary on this episode is that essentially that our words, especially what he calls our idle words, words that we say out of frustration or words that we say without thinking, have real effect, and that we need to be very watchful of what we say in general, because it could bring about real harm. And in this case, it brought about the death of these 4 monks before they could repent. So the way Gregory sees this episode in the life of Florentius is that God was trying to teach him that he needs to be very careful of how he uses his words, especially about the need to avoid idle chatter. So later, Gregory tells a story about a saint who is able to bring back someone from the dead. And then Peter says that, or the deacon Peter says that, resurrection from the dead or bringing back someone from the dead is the greatest of all miracles. But Gregory corrects him and he says, actually, it's not the greatest of all miracles because that person is just going to die again. Rather, the greatest of all miracles is when someone is able to bring a sinner away from their life of sin and bring them towards God, because in that way, that man will live forever. In the even if he dies physically, he's going to live forever with Christ, or with God. So that is actually the greatest of all miracles, and not simply bringing back someone physically from the dead. So Gregory leaves Italy for a little bit, and he goes to talk about some stories in North Africa. So specifically, he's talking about some of these Vandal kingdoms in North Africa, and the Vandals, they had a really strong tendency towards Arianism, but there was a Spanish bishop named Leander who was able to convert one of the Vandal kings, Hermegild, to Orthodoxy or Catholicism, away from Arianism. But then his Arian father deposes him as the king and throws him into prison. And we're told that Hermegild was such a holy man after his conversion that he didn't really care about being in prison. And then on Easter, an Arian bishop attempts to offer him communion, but Hermegild refuses because of how it was consecrated by an Arian bishop, and he doesn't consider it appropriate for him to partake of it. And this threw his father into an absolute rage, and he had his son killed. But around his body, people began to hear singing, and they saw these burning lamps around his body. So this is a very similar thing that we saw in the life of Saints Boris and Gleb, where around their bodies as well, we saw the people saw these burning lamps and this angelic singing. And then because people saw this, they began to venerate Hermegild as this martyr, because even though the Vandals, the leadership was mostly Arian, that wasn't really the case for the Christians, the non-nobility who were living in North Africa. They were largely non-Arians. So eventually the father dies, and then his son, so this would be Hermegild's brother, gets on the throne, and he is also an Arian. However, we're told, soon after he became king, he gave up the heretical ways of his father to follow the example of his martyr brother. Once converted from Arianism, he strove zealously to lead the whole Visigothic race to the true faith, not allowing anyone to serve in his kingdom, who by his heresy remained an enemy to God's kingdom. It is not surprising that he became a herald of the faith, for through the merits of his martyr brother, he obtained help from above to lead many souls back to God's fatherly embrace. And then Gregory adds, "We must realize, however, that this work could not have been accomplished if King Hermegild had not died for the truth." So here Gregory is emphasizing the power of martyrdom, the power of the intercession of the saints, the power of these cults of the saints. And again, we have this idea of spiritual reconquest, where even in death, these faithful Christians are able to sanctify the land, sanctify the kingdom. It was through Hermegild's martyrdom that North Africa was brought away from the Arian heresy. Gregory then tells a story about his own life, something that happened to him personally. So this was back when he was still a monastic, and he was very sick, and This was in the lead up to Easter, and he wanted to fast on Holy Saturday. So he asked another monk named Eleutherius to pray for him so that he could have the strength to fast on Holy Saturday. And so the monk made a prayer, and we're told that he made a prayer with many tears. And because of this, Gregory was able to fast. Then Peter asks, he says, what then is the power of tears? And then Gregory tells us that there are two types of tears. There's the tears from the fear of God, and then later you develop those tears of love. And he relates this to a story in the Bible, specifically in Joshua, the book of Joshua, when Caleb gives his daughter Aksa 2 pools of water, like an upper and then the lower pool. And he says, just as she, so Aksa, begged her father Caleb with a sigh for pools of water, so must we with deep groans obtain from our Creator the grace of tears. There are some who have received the gift of speaking out openly for justice, of defending the oppressed, of sharing their possessions with the needy, of professing their faith ardently, who still do not have the grace of tears. These, we may say, received land in the Negeb, that is, southern and dry land, but are completely lacking in pools of water. It is of utmost importance, however, that those who are zealous for good works and devote much time to performing them should also weep over their past sins, either through fear of eternal punishment or through longing for God's kingdom. Caleb gave Aksa the upper and lower pools. These correspond to the 2 kinds of compunction. The soul receives the upper pools when it weeps because of its longing for heaven. It receives the lower pools when the fear of hell causes it to break forth in tears. Actually, the lower pools are given first, then only the upper. Yet since the compunction of love is greater in dignity, the upper pools were necessarily mentioned first and then the lower. So we see how Gregory has this very allegorical interpretation of the Bible. Of course, he thinks that the Bible can also be interpreted differently as well in other ways that, aren't contradictory. However, here he's emphasizing this sort of allegorical interpretation. So he takes this story from the Bible most people probably don't even know of the story or read it and just glazed over it. Like I had to reread the story myself. I didn't really remember it in the Bible. But he takes this story about land distribution and he relates it to the spiritual life. And we see that, he interprets the Bible this way, but he also interprets history this way. So I'll give an example here. So Gregory tells a story about Redemptus, and he was a saintly bishop who told Gregory of a vision he had. So Redemptus was sleeping near the tomb of Saint Justin Martyr, and then Justin visits him in a dream, and he says to him 3 times that the end of all flesh is here. And then we're told that terrible signs in the heavens followed. In the north appeared the gleaming spears of an army in battle array. It was not long after this vision that wild hordes of Lombards, unleashed from their own native land, descended on us. The population of Italy, which had grown vast like a rich harvest of grain, was cut down to wither away. Cities were sacked, fortifications overthrown, churches burned, monasteries and cloisters destroyed, farms were abandoned, and the countryside uncultivated, became a wilderness. The land was no longer occupied by its owners, and wild beasts roamed the fields where so many people had once made their homes. I do not know what is happening elsewhere, but in this land of ours, the world is not merely announcing its end, it's pointing directly to it. So the way that Gregory is interpreting these Lombard invasions and the general kind of chaos happening in Italy is that it points to a larger reality. In the same way that he looks at these stories in the Bible and shows how they point to a larger reality as well.
All right, so we can now turn to the second book, which, as I said, is the most probably famous of all the books in the dialogues, because it's the one that really focuses in on the life of Saint Benedict. And it's really the primary and really only source, or only good source, at least we have, for the life of Saint Benedict from this time. So Gregory lets us know that his source material is going to be 4 of Saint Benedict's disciples that he's been in contact with. And we learned that Saint Benedict was born to wealthy parents, quite wealthy parents, who put him through rigorous studies. But he ended up abandoning all of that, all of what he could have had a pretty good earthly secular life. But he abandons all of that to please God, and he lives alone for 3 years in a narrow cave. And the only one who knew where he was another monk named Romanos, who would occasionally give him supplies that he needed. And then we read from Gregory, he says, "At length a time came when Almighty God wished to grant him rest from his toil and reveal Benedict's virtuous life to others." So this is a common trope that we see in these stories of these monastic and hermetic saints, is that oftentimes they need to be in the wilderness by themselves for a while. And then after a couple of years, then they start taking in visitors and people learn about them. So this is what happened with Saint Benedict. So after 3 years of sort of solitude, with just occasional visits like supply drops from the other monk, God reveals him to the world, and people begin to come and visit and try to get spiritual nourishment from him. So one story that we read about with Saint Benedict is that one day while he was struggling, or he was walking along a path, and he was struggling with these temptations of lust, and he saw on his path that there was nettles and briars, so basically a very large thorn bush that was next to him. So in order to help him deal with the temptation, what he does is that Saint Benedict, he takes off his clothes and then he jumps into the thorns and has the thorns just prick him, and he rolls around in them for a while, and he's just bleeding everywhere. But the pain that was burning his whole body had put out the fires of evil in his heart. So complete was his triumph that from then on, as he later told his disciples, he never experienced another temptation of this kind. Soon after, many forsook the world to place themselves under his guidance. For now that he was free from these temptations, he was ready to instruct others in the practice of virtue. That is why Moses commanded the Levites to begin their service when they were 25 years old or more, and to become guardians of the sacred vessels only at the age of 50. So again, we have Gregory relating a story back to the Bible, and he's saying that there's a reason why the Levites had certain, age requirements, for their service. And he says it's related to spiritual maturity in the same way that Saint Benedict needed some level of spiritual maturity before he ministered to people and received them. So too the Levites also needed some spiritual maturity before they took on the various duties. Another important aspect about Benedict's life is that he was quite an influential monastic reformer. He's famous for his monastic rule, but he wasn't always that popular because of his monastic rule and how he was really trying to tone in a lot of the excesses that were going on in monasticism, at least that he saw. So we learned that one time while he was an abbot, so he was invited to be an abbot of a monastery, and then he goes into the monastery and he starts, implementing his rule. He starts, making sure the monks are being good monks and not, being lazy and all that. And then they get so mad at him that they basically drive him out. They even tried to poison him at one point because they simply did not like him as their abbot. And then after this experience, he pretty much just lives alone for the rest of his life. Not all the time, of course. Even these hermits, they never live alone 100%. At least most of the time they don't. So we learned that he does establish 12 monasteries, but he doesn't really stay in any particular one of them. But he does establish 12 monasteries, and he implements his rule. And he even builds one of the monasteries, we learn, on top of an old temple to Apollo that he demolished. So again, even with Benedict, he understands this idea of this spiritual reconquest that's taking place when you build a church or a monastery on top of some old pagan site. You, in a sense, you take back the land, right? So during his time, Benedict became quite famous and quite renowned, even renowned to the Ostrogothic king Totila. So Totila heard of Saint Benedict and he wanted to test him. So what he does is that he sends a messenger to him saying that the king is coming to visit him. And then instead of going himself, he dresses up one of his servants in the royal clothes and has him go and talk to Saint Benedict and present himself as the king to test him to see whether or not he would know if that's the real king or not. So when the servant is sent with the clothes on, Benedict realizes, he's like, what are you doing with those clothes? Those clothes aren't yours. Those are a king's clothes and you're not the king. And so then, Totila realizes, okay, this guy is the real deal. King Totila, we read, then went to the monastery in person. The moment he noticed the man of God sitting at a distance, he was afraid to come any closer and fell down prostrate where he was. 2 or 3 times Benedict asked him to rise. When Totila still hesitated to do so in his presence, the servant of Christ, so Benedict, walked over to him and with his own hands helped him from the ground. Then he rebuked the king for his crimes and briefly foretold everything that was going to happen to him. "You are the cause of many evils," he said. "You have caused many in the past. Put it in now to your wickedness. You will enter Rome and cross the sea. You have 9 more years to rule, and in the 10th year you will die." Terrified at these words, the king asked for a blessing and went away. From that time on, he was less cruel. Not long after, he went to Rome and then crossed over to Sicily. In the 10th year of his reign, he lost his kingdom and his life, as Almighty God had decreed. So Benedict then makes another prediction to a bishop at the time. So the bishop asked him, or the bishop essentially said that Totila is going to destroy the city of Rome. But then Benedict tells him that he's not. He says, rather, Rome will not be destroyed by the barbarians. It will be shaken by tempests and lightnings, hurricanes and earthquakes, until finally it lies buried in its own ruins. And then Gregory adds his commentary. He says, the meaning of this prophecy is perfectly clear to us now. We have watched the walls of Rome crumble and have seen its homes in ruins, its churches destroyed by violent storms, and its dilapidated buildings surrounded by their own debris. And for some background of what this is referring to, so Totila didn't actually invade and destroy Rome. Rather, the Eastern Romans, so like Belisarius and Saint Justinian, the emperor, they were able to essentially convince Totila to not destroy Rome. However, Rome still suffered a lot just due to natural disasters at this time. So Benedict, basically perceived that Totila won't destroy Rome, but it's still going to suffer a lot from these natural disasters. And then Saint Benedict even predicts that his principal monastery at Monte Cassino is going to fall, but he assured his brethren that after a very long and difficult prayer with God, he was able to make sure or ensure that the brethren won't be slain, even though the monastery will be destroyed. And then a little bit after he died, the Lombards then destroyed the monastery. So I hope you're really getting the sense for what kind of a post-apocalyptic situation that Italy was in at this time, especially the place that had been the central seat of one of the most powerful empires of its time, right? So I'll just finish up with a couple more anecdotes from Benedict's life. So one that I found rather interesting was that Benedict had once threatened these 2 nuns. He threatened to excommunicate these 2 nuns for some rather unseemly behavior. And they soon after died, and they were buried inside of a parish church. So they weren't exactly excommunicated. He just threatened that, if you don't stop this behavior, then you will be excommunicated. And then they died, but he never formally excommunicated them. But somebody who went to the church regularly saw that during the liturgy or during the mass, whenever they would ask the catechumens to depart, the nuns who were buried in the coffins inside the church were told that they were seen getting up out of their coffins and then leaving the church with all the other catechumens. So Benedict is informed of this. So what he has done is that he basically makes a bunch of bread and he has it offered. He basically gives it to be offered for the Eucharist, and he says, give the priest the bread, say the Eucharist or say the Mass, and then make sure that you mention those nuns' names. And then after that, after the Mass was said for those dead nuns, after that they were no longer seen leaving their coffins. So Peter says, is it not extraordinary that souls already judged at God's invisible tribunal could be pardoned by a man who was still living in the mortal flesh, however holy and revered he may have been? And then Gregory answers him, and he says, what of Peter the Apostle? Was he not still living in the flesh when he heard the words, whatever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven? All those who govern the church in matters of faith and morals exercise the same power of binding and loosing that he received. So what that entails for Gregory's views of papal supremacy, I'll leave that to your discretion. So moving to the end of Benedict's earthly life, he predicts that he is going to die soon, and then shortly after he gets very sick, and then he passes away. But there was something interesting that happened when he died. We're told that day, the day he died, 2 monks, one of them at the monastery, the other some distance away, received the very same revelation. They both saw a magnificent road covered with rich carpeting and glittering with thousands of lights. From his monastery, it stretched eastward in a straight line until it reached up into heaven. And there in the brightness stood a man of majestic appearance, who asked them, "Do you know who passed this way?" "No," they replied. This, he told them, is the road taken by blessed Benedict, the Lord's beloved, when he went to heaven. Thus, while the brethren who were with Benedict witnessed his death, those who were absent knew about it through the sign he had promised them. His body was laid to rest in the chapel of St. John the Baptist, which he had built to replace the altar of Apollo. And we learn, of course, that his body is miracle working. But what's even more interesting, or more significant perhaps, is that even the cave that he stayed in when he was a hermit for those first 3 or so years is miracle working. And then Peter sort of inquires into this. He's like, look, we've heard of people whose relics and their bodies have performed miracles, but I've never heard of, the place that somebody stayed at for a little bit being miracle working. And then Gregory essentially tells Peter that it's a special grace that some really holy people have, where even areas that they have visited become, in a sense, relics, because they're they have some part of them there that are able to work miracles. So that's really the end of all that I'm going to talk about. I was going to go into the last dialogue, which delves a little into theology and sort of the the soul after death in particular. However, I think we've gone on quite enough time. If you want to read this book, you can find free open source translations online. They're a little bit outdated, or you can get the some newer translations as well. But besides that pretty much wraps everything up. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you got something out of this. Take care.